Great. Welcome, everyone. So good to see you as folks come into the Zoom space. We're so grateful that you're here. We're going to ask that you keep yourself on mute as we get settled and get through our presentations. And then we have made sure that we have time for Q&A, which is always part of the fun of being in a real live Zoom meeting so that we can be in touch with each other and be in fellowship and community. So we'll just give a couple of moments. I see people coming in the room. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And again, welcome to all of you on Facebook Live. Please use the comment area on Facebook as well if you don't happen to be in the meeting on Zoom, so that we can be looking to see any questions or comments that come in there as well. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started as people are continuing to join us. My name is Susanna Tuttle, and I am the director of the North Carolina Council of Churches Eco-Justice Connection. We are the North Carolina state affiliate to the National Interfaith Power and Light Network, and our campaigns work to address the issues, challenges, and values of energy justice and energy democracy. Before we begin, let us all ground ourselves by taking some deep breaths. Find yourself in your body in relationship to the earth, that which holds us together as one on this glorious planet. We acknowledge that here in North Carolina, as in every other part of our country, we are on Indigenous land. Our state is home to the highest Indigenous population east of Oklahoma. And by acknowledging that the land we each reside within and depend upon is Indigenous land. This is one way we seek to orient ourselves in the work that we do in the name of justice in our lives. Today, we honor each tribe, their ancestral land, their presence in North Carolina today, and our commitment to repair the harm of the present and past. I will uplift that where I live in Western Orange County outside Chapel Hill, I believe I am on the occupied lands of the Eno, Occaneechi, and Shakori Native peoples. I invite you to take a moment to name the people whose lands you rely upon now. You're welcome to put that into the chat if we'd like to share. And if you do not know, this is also an invitation to learn. As for why we are gathered here today, North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light is a multi-faith campaign of the North Carolina Council of Churches' broader program, the Eco-Justice Connection, which focuses on environmental and climate justice. It is our mission to educate, inspire, and mobilize people of faith and conscience in this state to act on climate and justice issues as a moral imperative. Today's webinar is the second in a two-part series titled Biogas and Communities. It is our intention to educate faith communities about the problem of hog waste biogas and to amplify local community voices on this issue. This webinar is streaming live on Facebook, as I said, hello out there, and a recording will be available on NCIPL's YouTube page that we'll share with our network. Please keep yourself on mute throughout the presentations for those of you that are on Zoom. And we do hope that you will use the chat for questions throughout the event. Comments are great, anything that you want to be communicating during this important time together. And we will compile them for the speakers during the Q&A. As a prelude to these two biogas and community educational webinars, we encouraged our congregational network to witness the meeting of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality's, DEQ, Environmental Justice Advisory Council to hear from citizens who would be affected by hog waste biogas technology and permitting. And with that, I will pass it over to Susan Brooks. Susan has been serving as NCIPL's Eco Justice Education and Advocacy Fellow this fall. And we are grateful for her passion and commitment to protect the people and places that we love. Susan has spearheaded the outreach as a volunteer, has led all of the communication efforts that are making these webinars possible. Passing it to you, Susan.
Thanks, Susanna. I am so pleased to be here with you all. And as Susanna mentioned, we had our previous webinar, the first of the two, on October 19th. And I'm just going to give you a brief recap. But if you want to see the whole thing, and I highly encourage you to, it's posted on Facebook and YouTube, and it's well worth watching. Sherry White Williamson, the Environmental Justice Policy Director for the North Carolina Conservation Network, facilitated last time's discussion. And joining her were Will Hendrick, the Environmental Justice Advocate at the North Carolina Conservation Network, and Devon Hall, the co-founder and project manager for Duplin Reach. And Sherry did an excellent job facilitating and passing along questions that were really relevant and interesting and informative. Will presented and introduced the issue of biogas. He provided a key historical context, and he gave an idea of recent developments, opportunities for engagement, and next steps. He defined environmental justice as the intersection of environmental law and civil rights law. And he talked about the hog lagoon and spray field system of industrial hog operations, or CAFOs, contained animal feeding operations. And he talked about the adverse impacts on water, air, soil, public health, and quality of life, among other things, caused by hog waste. And also the disproportionate and cumulative impacts on the communities there, particularly communities of color. Devon then talked about what communities are living with in real terms, and he asked how we can engage in conversation to shed light on what they're living with and to initiate change. He talked about how the community pays for the waste rather than the operations. And he mentioned something that was revelatory to many people, that Smithfield Foods is actually owned by a Hong Kong company, the WH Group. And so efforts to give them preferential treatment are actually helping a foreign company. So with that said, and again, I can't do it justice, so I hope you will watch. Let me introduce our presenters tonight. I'm going to give a very brief introduction and then let them do what they would do best, which is tell us about themselves when it's their turn to speak. So first is Blakely Hildebrand. Blakely is an attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center's Chapel Hill office, and Blakely will be facilitating for us tonight. We also have Daisha Williams, who is the Environmental Justice Manager for Clean Air North Carolina. Donna Chavis is the founder of the Robeson County RedTailed Hawk Collective. And Mac, I might mispronounce this, Ledgerton is an ordained minister with the United Church of Christ and happens to be the husband of Donna. And so we're so pleased to have you all here. And as Susanna mentioned, this webinar is the second in a two-part series titled Biogas and Communities. And tonight we want to issue a call to action for collaboration with and support of our local communities. So thank you all for coming, and I'm going to hand it over to Blakely.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you to the organizers of this event for hosting this event and having this really important conversation. And I'm really pleased to be here with you, and especially pleased to be on the panel with these great speakers tonight who I've gotten to know over the last many months of collaboration and coordination with them. Susan just previewed for all of you, or I'm sorry, provided a recap on what the last webinar in this series covered. And what I'd like to do is just provide a little bit more detail and unpack a little bit what Susan just talked through, so we can all have additional context for our conversation tonight. So I am going to attempt to share my screen here. Let me see if I can do that. Here we are. And all right. Can I get a thumbs up if folks can see that? All right, thank you. Let's see here. There we go. So I want to provide, again, just a little bit of background so we all kind of have a general understanding, a common understanding about the issues that we're going to talk about tonight. And for some of you, this may be a review. For others, this may be new information. But just as by way of context, North Carolina is the second largest hog producer in the country. We are second only to Iowa. And Duplin and Sampson counties in the southeastern part of the state are the top 2 hog producing counties in the country. That's despite the fact that that Iowa produces twice as many hogs as North Carolina does. So that should give you a sense of how many hogs are located in those 2 counties alone. And certainly hog operations are spread all across the southeastern part of the state. There are about 9 million hogs that are housed at about 2,000 hog operations across eastern North Carolina, storing about 9 billion, and that's billion with a B, gallons of untreated hog waste. The image that you see on your screen right now is an aerial image of what a typical hog operation looks like. You see these containment barns. This is where the hogs are kept. And these giant pits, these are called lagoons, and this is where the industry stores all of the waste. The waste management system that industrial hog operations use in North Carolina, we call the lagoon and spray field system. And essentially what happens is the animals produce waste in these barns. That waste is then flushed into these giant open air lagoons and then sprayed onto nearby fields. As Susan alluded to, pollution can move into the environment in a lot of different ways. The pollution can run off from spray fields into rivers and streams. Pollution can seep into the groundwater from the spray fields and from those large lagoons. Emissions from air pollution from both the lagoons and the spray fields can impact people living nearby. And what you'll hear, what a lot of people who live nearby these hog operations talk about are the odors as well. And odors emanate from the barns, from the spray fields, and from the lagoons themselves. All of this pollution has detrimental impacts to human health. People living by these hog operations die at higher rates from common diseases and suffer higher rates of infant mortality and low birth weight, and experience respiratory diseases at higher rates than people who live farther away. And as Daisha will talk about in more detail, the burden of this pollution disproportionately falls to communities of color and low wealth communities in eastern North Carolina. Just one more note on the health impacts. There was a study that was published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences earlier this year that demonstrated that 89 people in Duplin County alone died prematurely as a result of emissions from hog operations. It is not hyperbolic to say that people are dying as a result of pollution from these hog operations. These hog operations also present a real climate vulnerability. We've talked, I know you all have been hearing a lot about climate change and what we can do to become a resilient state. Updating the waste management systems at these hog operations is one of many things that we can do. This is an aerial image of a hog operation after Hurricane Florence, which was one of 2 1,000-year storms to hit eastern North Carolina within a 2-year period. And while there have been some changes on the ground or in the law regarding the regulation of these facilities, by and large, very little has actually changed on the ground. And just to begin the discussion about what we're talking about tonight, biogas. What is biogas? Why are we talking about it? Why should you care? Why should communities of faith care about this issue? And biogas is really kind of the next frontier of this issue. Biogas development in North Carolina we are on the verge of a lot of growth in this industry, and I'm really glad that we're engaging in this conversation. So biogas is a term that industry developed to describe energy that's derived from energy derived from, hog waste. And some people call it pig poop gas, others call it factory farm gas. I've heard a lot of different names, but I think for the purposes of this conversation, I think we're all using the term biogas. And biogas is used, and I'm going to show you an infographic here. Biogas is generated by capping a hog waste lagoon, that we were just talking about a few minutes ago. Capping a hog waste lagoon, siphoning off the methane and other air emissions that are then transported off-site and turned into fuel. The rest of the remaining waste in those lagoons is then transferred to an open air lagoon and then sprayed onto nearby fields. So what this, and Smithfield and Dominion, who are the two primary biogas developers in North Carolina, are proposing to generate biogas in this way. And this proposal relies on the harmful lagoon and spray field waste management system that I was noting a few minutes ago. Creates pollution and health impacts, and it has adverse health impacts for people living nearby. Unfortunately, Smithfield and Dominion are doubling down on the most damaging and cheap system for storing hog waste pollution, rather than investing in cleaner technology that would protect communities and protect the environment and the health impacts associated with the lagoon and spray field system. And one important note is that I want to make here, one important point I want to make here is that biogas development can actually make pollution even worse for these communities. Storing waste in a digester and then transferring it to an open air lagoon and then spraying it onto fields can actually increase ammonia emissions, which can contribute to water pollution and air pollution and human health effects. North Carolina is unique in that we are the only state in the country that has a legal requirement to produce energy from swine waste. There are a lot of states in the country that have what's called a renewable energy portfolio standard, or a requirement for utilities to generate electricity from renewable sources. And back in 2007, when the North Carolina legislature was developing North Carolina's renewable energy portfolio standard, the legislature decided to include swine waste to energy and poultry waste to energy into our what we call our REPS standard. And so in North Carolina, we do have a mandate for biogas. And what we've been working on in coalition with community groups who are both living in community and working with community groups is to talk about cleaner solutions, because using the lagoon and spray field system is not the only way to produce biogas. There are cleaner solutions that protect communities and protect the environment, that are affordable, that are used in other states by Smithfield in particular, and that will better protect the environment. And I'll just briefly touch on a couple of things that SELC, in conjunction with community members and community groups, have been working on over the last several months, and then pass the mic over to Daisha. And we actually worked with Daisha's organization, Clean Air NC, in challenging an air quality permit for a biogas project. And actually, let me pause real quick and provide a little bit more context. In North Carolina, as Smithfield Foods and Dominion Energy have proposed the first major biogas project in the state. It's called the Grady Road Project. And what it will involve is capping hog waste lagoons at 19 industrial hog operations in Duplin and Sampson County, constructing a central processing facility where all the biogas will be collected and processed. And then finally, the pipeline that connects the hog operations with the central processing facility. So think of it as a hub and spoke model, with the processing facility at the hub and the industrial hog operations that are generating the biogas as the spokes. And the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality is engaged in several, or it has issued several permits for this first project. SELC worked with Clean Air NC in challenging an air quality permit for the processing facility, and I'll let Daisha talk more about that. We're also working with Environmental Justice Community Action Network and Cape Fear River Watch in challenging several water permits that were issued. And in partnership with the Duplin County NAACP and the North Carolina Poor People's Campaign, we've recently filed a civil rights complaint with the federal environmental, or the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, alleging that these permits have a discriminatory impact on communities of color. And we're working with partners, including all of the folks that are on the webinar today, in elevating these issues and at the state legislature with the Cooper administration, as well as with the administration, or the Biden administration in DC. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass the floor over to Daisha to talk more about the disproportionate impacts of these facilities on communities of color and the work that Clean Air NC is doing to engage communities moving forward.
Yes, thank you, Blakely. And I'm going to share my screen as well, so I'm not just talking at you. Is everyone see it? It's good. Awesome. So yeah, thank you, Blakely, for that overview. And thank you for everyone here today for your willingness to learn and to be more engaged around these really important issues. I just wanted to actually start this presentation with something that Mr. Devon Hall from Duplin County said in the first webinar that really stuck out to me, which was, how can we engage to really shed some light on what we're living with in these communities? And I think a lot of us are taking that first step of engaging by being here today to listen to impacted communities and to learn about how we can be better allies. But the second part of what he said on shedding light on these issues is also important, because in order to be proper advocates, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of those who we are advocating for. And this is an important step in fighting for environmental justice, which is an issue that arises when communities, primarily low income or BIPOC communities, are disproportionately impacted by sources of pollution located near where they live and work. And this map that I have here on this slide, along with some others that I've prepared, so bear with me, only begins to tell the story of environmental injustice that these communities are experiencing. And I know many of you here today, especially if you attended the first webinar and you've been involved in the great efforts of NCIPL, you're aware of environmental justice, but what does it look like exactly? So for starters, this map contains known locations of CAFOs in North Carolina. And if you're familiar with our state, you know that this region where the facilities are concentrated in Eastern NC are primary rural communities. But just diving into this a little bit more and the demographics that encompass these rural communities, this map was created through the EPA EJ screen tool. And I know that there's a lot going on here, but what I did was single out counties in North Carolina that are hit hardest by the impacts of CAFOs based on studies, but also based on the concentration of facilities, which are Duplin, Sampson, Bladen, Wayne, and Robeson counties. And that's indicated by the red boundaries. And I just want to clarify that this is not saying that other counties are not impacted, but just for the sake of time, I wanted to focus on these. So I added a low income index, which is represented by the varying colors. And this tells us where individuals' income is less than 2 times the poverty level. So essentially, as you can see from the legend, if an area is shaded in red, then the population is an equal or higher percent low income than where there is 95 to 100% of the US population, and so forth with the 90 to 95 percentile and the 80 to 90 percentile, et cetera. But the main takeaway here is that there is a significant low income population where these facilities are located. And when you compare this with other demographic data, we really start to see the case for environmental injustice. So this next map, similar to the one before, displays percentiles in several shades, but this time the data is showing us populations who have received less than a high school education. As you can see, again, there's a significant portion of the population within this category. And I just wanted to bring this up because this is a factor that industries use when deciding on where to locate their facilities. They see less educated communities as a path of least resistance because they believe they have fewer resources and political clout to oppose the sitting of their unwanted facilities. And finally, I also wanted to share this map, which is a demographic index, and it shows where there's a combination of both low income and BIPOC populations. As you can see, Robeson County falls heavily within these parameters, and it's home to the Lumbee tribe, which is the largest non-federally recognized tribal community east of the Mississippi River. And I'll let Donna touch upon, if she's willing, more of the complexities that arise on polluted indigenous lands. But I just wanted to bring this up because these are real people, these are real cultures, real land that's being impacted. And when we talk about CAFOs, the conversation is typically geared towards hog operations, but as many of you know, there are different types of concentrated animal feeding operations, all of which contribute, or all of which continue to primarily concentrate themselves in Eastern North Carolina. And this clustering contributes to the notion of cumulative impacts, which has been covered briefly in the previous webinar, but it can be described as the lived-in reality that communities experience when multiple polluting facilities locate themselves within the same region. And this is something that EJ advocates and communities are constantly fighting for because it's not something that's considered heavily within the regulatory landscape. And this is really concerning because when a new poultry or a new swine or cattle CAFO, or even just another polluting facility is established in this region that you can see is already heavily polluted, the potential pollution that a new facility will emit does not exist separately just within the confines of that facility. It builds upon the pollution of the hundreds of other CAFOs and the other facilities that exist in the region. And when we talk about biogas, which Blakely has covered, that will rely on an outdated system of the spray field and lagoon system, this just further adds to the issue of cumulative impacts because it will further entrench and just essentially entrench the system into being. And part of that can be seen here. So what I did here was overlay the CAFOs layer with the health rankings of North Carolina counties. So in this map, the worse the health ranking, the darker shade of blue. And if you look at where CAFOs are located, these areas are also coupled with poor health rankings. So it doesn't take a scientist to just see these patterns and see that they exist. And for us, as an advocacy organization, this is a primary reason that, and for many of the EJ concerns covered, that we have and continue to be heavily involved within the issue of biogas and CAFOs. So Blakely had mentioned briefly, but we recently reached a settlement agreement on behalf of SELC with Align RNG for tighter restrictions on a proposed biogas plant that's located on the border of Duplin and Sampson counties. So this agreement includes new restrictions on gas plant operations to limit its emissions of gases containing sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide, which are very harmful to human health. The agreement also strengthens existing sulfur dioxide pollution limits with increased accountability for Align's operations through more frequent and accurate monitoring of the plant's air emissions. And the goal of this accountability measure is to improve transparency through new reporting of this information that will allow the communities in this area to verify and enforce the plant's compliance with the state law and the Clean Air Act. And the overall hope with this agreement is that it will set the stage for stricter statewide regulation on biogas. And while this is the first settlement of its kind that puts capping limits on emissions from biogas plants, it's nowhere near where we need to be to address the serious threat that CAFOs have and continues to have on these communities, as well as the new heightened threat of biogas. And there are ways that you all here tonight can contribute and bring more attention to these issues. And I'll let Donna and Mac potentially speak on specific ways to help advocate for the community. But at the state level, there are ways to advocate. So as I don't know if Blakely mentioned the Farm Act, but it was passed and it essentially will give way to biogas projects. And within the Farm Act, the DEQ has exactly 12 months from July 1st to draft a general permit for existing hog farms to apply for. And the department is in the process of having of developing a stakeholder process to have group sessions with experts to talk about specific details behind the permit, but they'll also hold a public meeting, forum, and open public comment period around this general permit on biogas. So I would just say show out to these meetings for our vulnerable North Carolina communities that are being impacted by this very serious issue. If you can, connect with members of the community and learn of ways to elevate their voices and to be a better ally. Because the more the DEQ hears from the public, the more chances we have to strengthen the permitting process. And you don't have to be an expert to be an advocate. There are several points you can raise, starting with the disproportionate impact that these activities have. So the concept of environmental justice. You can also bring up that there's currently no guidance provided by the Department of Environmental Quality to address cumulative impacts. You can also advocate for the need for more data collection around the impacts of waste management in communities next to hog operations where biogas projects will reside. There's no monitoring done around these emissions. And I can certainly be a resource for those that are looking to get more involved and may want help in developing their comments as the opportunity arises. But I do want to point out that while I am an environmental justice manager, the real experts when it comes to this topic are the communities that experience this day in and day out. And the stories and voices of those who are impacted need to be elevated. So with that said, I would like to turn the floor to Donna and Mac. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisha. And Susan is putting up my slides right now. And with that, I will, there you go. The first slide you see is a statement about the principles of environmental justice. And before I reference that slide, I am the founder of the RedTailed Hawk Collective, which is housed in Pembroke, since that is where I live. However, it was founded to address the issues related to all Indigenous peoples in North Carolina who was being impacted by the effort to site the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. There were 4 tribes and 2 urban Indian centers who were directly in the route, and over 30,000 Indigenous peoples individually would have been impacted had that project been allowed to go to fruition. And I'm also the senior climate campaigner with Friends of the Earth, which gives me a little bit larger geography in terms of Friends of the Earth is a national organization, but my work is predominantly focused in North Carolina and beginning to expand into other southeastern states. And what you see here is a statement about the principles of environmental justice. And these were 17 principles that were released on October 27th in 1991, 30 years ago. We've just commemorated the 30th anniversary of these principles that grew out of the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And this summit was significant, and in some historical versions, it is said that it's probably the largest development in the issues related to environmental racism that took place and has taken place. The principles are still very much in use and continue to be a predominant presence within impacted communities throughout the United States and beyond it. They're also used internationally. Next slide. What you see here, and was the general overview of my topic, is examples of concentrated animal feeding operations in swine and poultry. And as Daisha mentioned earlier, and I think also Brooke, we are dealing primarily with swine in this evening, but poultry is a major concern. Robeson County is the most racially diverse rural county in the United States, and its population of 130,000 is 42% indigenous, 25% white, 23% Black, and 10% Latinx. That equals out to 75% communities of color and other ethnic groups. And as has already been said, we're predominantly targeted for these kind of schemes and projects. Next slide. I've already said that, so we can move to the next one. As you can see, Robeson County has a unique ecosystem with 50 swamps and a river running through it. At one point, there were hundreds of swamps in our counties, and the waterways were and still are a critical part of our culture, in the indigenous people's culture. It's what made Robeson what it is. We lost a number of the swamps through to infilling for development, and that has had a major effect in terms of changing water flow patterns. And in current day, with the superstorms we've had, it's had a major effect with how the water does not leave communities and ends up with so much more flooding. Next. What we have within a 35-mile radius of Pembroke, where I live, is Mount AIRE, which is the largest processing facility, chicken processing facility in the world. We also have Smithfield, which is in Bladen County, but it's within 35 miles of Pembroke, which is the largest hog processing facility in the world. And then Campbell Soup, and you might wonder why Campbell Soup is here. But it's one of the industry's largest soup processing centers in the world, and it does process a lot of poultry in its soup making. Next. In the permitting process in North Carolina, they require only water quality permits for the hog factory farms. They do not require air permits for the farms. They are now requiring air permits for the digesters. But as you can see, the permitting process is a little bit shaky here, even for the swine operations. As it is with the poultry factory farms, there are no water permit or air permits required. So that because the chicken litter is deemed dry, they don't require water permits, and the industry is totally unregulated. The communities in Robeson, as the poultry houses were beginning to proliferate in a way that seemed to be beyond control, was very surprised to learn that there was no permitting process. Now, there have been efforts in the state legislature to change that, but as one legislator said, Greg Meyer commented when he was given the question by a journalist, he says it's a hard slug to get these changes made. They've been at it for years, and they expect to be at it for years to come. So the spotlight is being shown on the issues related to these factory farms, poultry and swine, is critical to help our legislators to take steps forward in giving better permits to these industries. Next. With the poultry waste management, and you see this here, and in this picture here, what you see is mounds of litter. Now, they're allowed to only have these mounds grow to a certain size, but these conditions are broken quite often. And as I said before, they're really not given any kind of necessary permits because they're deemed permitted because they're dry litter. And so there's no compliance inspections or record submissions requirements or no public records of the locations. I do want to say one story about the poultry litter. It is often plowed under into fields for fertilizer, unlike the swine, which is a spray field. There are some times when there's some wetting of the litter and it's used for spray, but predominantly it's plowed under. I have had one occasion with a person in the community who lost a buffalo. And I tell this story because everyone can relate to the size of buffalo. If you've never seen one, believe you me, they're as large as they look in the movies. And one of their buffalo died. And so in cases like that, the state comes in and does a autopsy. And so after the autopsy was done, they came back to the family and said, now, what do you feed your buffalo? And the answer was hay, other than the field that they were in with natural grass. It turns out that the buffalo had died because of the hay, and it was hay that had been fertilized by the chicken litter. So I always tell that story because imagine the size of a buffalo dying because of the grass it was eating and the hay it was eating. Well, not the grass, I'm sorry, they did not use the fertilizer, but the hay that it was eating, having been grown with this type of fertilizer. You can only imagine what that means in terms of human beings, especially babies. Next. And as you have already heard from Brooke, there is also the major concern about runoff from the spray fields. And I'll just go to the next because this has already been covered. And as already has been mentioned, there are all kinds of concern about the water contaminations. And what you see here in this middle slide is poultry houses that were flooded during, this was after Florence. And after Matthew and Florence, we experienced in Robeson County cases when families were able to come out of their homes and go into their wooded areas for whatever reason. They found a number of carcasses of the chickens and hens out in the wooded areas that had come from these floods. And yet this is not an issue that's being addressed. We've been told over and over again, it's not a matter of if, but when we will have our next major flood. Next. What you see here is the processing of the meat when it comes to, this is poultry. And one of the issues that has been raised in terms of the health issues is related to COVID. In Robeson, there was any number of times that on any given day, we had the highest rate of COVID in the state. And there was at least once that we had the third highest in the country. One of the reasons for this is, we are sure, is related to the meatpacking industries that employ so many of our residents. And yet the industries, all of the meatpacking industries, poultry, swine, dairy, it doesn't matter, are protected in that they do not have to release any kinds of records of infections when it comes to issues like COVID. And so the only way we knew about the COVID rates was because we knew so many people who got sick, who worked in these meatpacking industries, and some who died. Next. And so I thank you for this. And I would like to go to the last slide. And then I will, I have a few more comments that I'd like to make. We're talking about the involvements of the church. And I just gave a brief review of some of the impacts of the factory farms and factory farm methane gas. And I do use factory farm methane gas as my preferred language because biogas implies that it's something neutral or something good even. And it is exactly what it is, factory farm methane gas. And these also have such an effect on and threaten the health and welfare of all of the Earth's beings, the winged ones, the fish, the four legs, and the two-legged, and yes, humans. So the church has always been a great influencer throughout the history of the world, and the United States in particular. That influence has not always supported the common good, but there are concrete examples of times when it was the church that made a major difference in the well-being of its constituents. I won't take you back too far in time so that the relevance is clear. For instance, during the time of slavery, the church was often a beacon in calling into question the morality of such a practice. In fact, church members, especially documented Quakers, aligned to help those enslaved escape sometimes back to their homeland. A component of this that is often left unacknowledged is that the path away from slavery was often supported by indigenous native tribes through their territories, along with the church programs that supported this. There are two more recent examples of the church's role in social justice issues. Those would be in support of the civil rights movement and the organizing of the United Farm Workers and their grape and lettuce boycott. In fact, it was my personal experience with the United Presbyterian Church's hunger program that made me aware of the Nestle boycott due to the bottle baby syndrome the company was associated with. Now, what does all that have to do with hog waste? Well, we acknowledge that church maintains great influence in this country. In this case, we are mostly referring to the Protestant Christian church, but the same is true of other faith and spiritual traditions. In the examples given earlier, the church gave a prophetic voice and leadership to the issues. In fact, it was the United Church of Christ that gave prophetic leadership to the early steps towards the environmental justice movement. Starting in the 80s in Warren County, North Carolina, in the fight against the dumping of PCBs in predominantly African-American communities, to the support and leadership that led to the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit and the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice in 1991. At the summit, the UCC was joined by delegations from the United Presbyterians, United Methodists, the National Council of Churches, the World Council of Churches, and many other denominations. No matter the religious or spiritual bent, we left the summit, all of us, not to just celebrate, but to take the call back to our communities most affected by environmental racism and in need of environmental justice. We must celebrate the history of the church, but we must also call it back to that history. The church is usually one of the most stable institutions in a community. It meets at a minimum weekly. The congregations are local and aware of the issues impacting their communities. The pastor has what is called a bully pulpit, from which she or he can lift up concerns and consider how they might respond. The church is already organized around their faith tradition and can house community groups that organize on those traditions' response to the needs. The church is once again being called outside of its walls to partner with its members and others to make sure that environmental racism, such as factory farms and its deadly methane gas, is not allowed to destroy communities. Two of my favorite scriptures are Micah 6:8 and Amos 5:24. In Micah, we are called to do justice and love kindness. And Amos calls us to let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Now let me close with a question. Who said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice? Now I would guess that most, if not all, said the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And you would be right for the more modern movements. However, the sentiment goes back to the 19th century in church history and has been reintroduced in various forms since 1853. Now, this fact surprised me whenever I first learned it. It was like, whoa, it really does speak to the history of the church towards justice. Theodore Parker was a Unitarian minister and prominent American transcendentalist born in 1810 who called for the abolition of slavery. In 1853, a collection of 10 sermons of religion by Parker was published, and the third sermon titled Of Justice and the Conscience included figurative language about the arc of the moral universe. And the quote was, "Look at the facts of the world. You see a continual and progressive triumph of the right. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. But from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice." Now, the words of Parker's sermon above foreshadow the Civil War fought in the 1860s. In 1964, we were once again gifted by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. with his poetic restatement. The church has long been called to bend towards justice, and I know it will continue to answer that call. Thank you. And I guess I pass it to Matt.
Sure. And I'd like to also invite Larry Baldwin in, and Larry, maybe we can have a conversation together as this last presentations together. Larry is a staff member with the Waterkeeper Alliance and was a former river keeper with the lower Neuse River, and is very familiar with the CAFO issue and with biogas. So Larry, why don't we have a discussion here? And I'd like to start by reflecting just on this word biogas and say a few words and then get your response. I actually prepared about 7 comments related to this subject, and maybe we'll get through those, or I can certainly send them on to you, Suzanne, if we don't get all the way through these. But I'm concerned about the word biogas because actually the only thing bio about it is the pollution that it causes and the hazard that it causes. The term that's being used in our environmental justice sectors now is factory farm methane gas, rather than they're also calling this renewable natural gas. And for me, Larry, there's nothing renewable about it, because actually the definition of renewable is that it's not depleted when used. And of course, this waste does not remain waste if it was, and it's certainly not natural. If it was natural and hogs were raised in their natural way that we're accustomed to, such as Donna's mom, we had hogs at the old home place and chickens. But when they're raised in their natural way, they don't produce a lot of methane that can escape into the environment. It's absorbed in a way right into the soil when hogs are raised at the scale that's appropriate to actually raising hogs in a more natural way. So this title, biogas and renewable natural gas, is really almost to the point of being a fraudulent description of this product. So what's your reflection on that?
Well, thanks, Mac, and good evening, everybody. Wasn't really thinking I was
Can you
gonna
speak just a little louder?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's good to see everybody. Wasn't aware I was going to be speaking tonight, but I have the pleasure of working with some of the people who you've already heard from tonight, from Blakely and Daisha and Marilyn Marsh Robinson, who's still on. But Mac, my boil it down to a statement is biogas, and I'm going to call it directed biogas. And there's a reason for that. We'll talk about it in a minute. And I know Blakely can certainly add information to that as well too. This biogas plant is nothing but a Band-Aid. The only thing that's being captured is methane. And the process, as you've heard, you put a tarp over the lagoon, which I call a cesspool, and you capture that methane gas. But in the process, and that there are not specific data figures yet, but the assumption is, at least at this point, that everything else that's the gas is captured underneath of that cover are in some ways being re-assimilated back into the liquid. So there have been estimates of like 3 to 12% increase in the toxicity of the waste being spread on the fields. So you capture the methane, everything else is still there. Okay. One of the big things that they want to claim is that this is going to do a lot for odor. Well, the odor is not being relieved that much because you're still spraying this untreated waste onto an open field. You still have some lagoons that can be uncovered, but you also have these huge tunnel fans at the end of each one of the barns that are actually drawing fresh air in and taking the polluted air out. They have to do that because if they did not have that ventilation, the hogs would die in their own waste fumes. So this whole thing to me is nothing but a scam. Mm-hmm. I sometimes go as far as we're being lied to. Okay, let's bring it down to very basic facts. We're being sold a product falsely. The public relations aspect of this thing, and Mac, you mentioned it a couple times. You know, we call this, you know, renewable energy. Well, sure, it's renewable energy because the pigs keep pooping. That's the only thing renewable about it. It's not green energy because we're not solving the problem that's impacting the water and or the communities.
Mhm.
And to go back real quick, and there's a number of different processes here. This one is called directed biogas, where the methane is being captured and it's being sent through pipes 30 miles long, who knows eventually how many of these substations they will have, where they're shipping it from or piping it from numerous CAFOs. And at this processing center that Blakely referred to, and it's cleaned up and it's basically put back in or put into the system. There's another process though, which is called anaerobic digestion. It's still not a good answer, but the difference in that, and we have one hog grower in North Carolina who is using this process. The difference is the process is taken care of right on his facility. He has a generator, all that is taken care of. But this gentleman will tell you this is not the answer. This directed biogas or biogas as a whole, it's nothing more than a Band-Aid. It's another way for the CAFO industry and the power companies to make more money. My own personal opinion is that it's not even going to benefit the individual grower. The first facilities that Blakely referred to that are being looked at are wholly owned Smithfield Foods hog facilities, which means Smithfield Food owns everything, the land, the buildings, the hogs, the equipment, everything. So when they do start looking at other independent hog growers, I think to some degree, the grower is being also fed some untruths about how much money they're going to make off of this process. So the whole process is just flawed from the very beginning. And we talked a little bit about, well, we're talking about biogas, and Donna mentioned a lot about the poultry. So there's also efforts in the works with what they refer to as biomass, which is the incineration of poultry waste. But there's also the potential of taking and capturing gas from the poultry waste. So, I mean, and we could go on for hours in this conversation, but the biggest problem we have here is we have an industry in the agricultural industry, meaning the CAFOs, the hogs and the poultry, and we have the power companies who, unfortunately, they kind of have the upper hand as far as public relations go. And that public relations, all they have to do is say it's renewable energy and it's good for the environment, and people are buying this thing. A real quick story back, and then I'll shut up for a little while. I went to a House hearing that they were talking about the farm bill, and one of the sections, I think it was a section 13, Blakely, I think it was 11. I'm sorry. Thank you. That's why we have the smart attorneys with us, because we can't remember all this stuff. They voted, a number of us spoke. Afterwards, Representative Pricey Harrison, if you all are familiar with Pricey, she's always been very good to us environmentally and even in reference to CAFOs. I had a chance to ask her, Pricey, why did you vote for this thing? Don't you understand that this is nothing but a Band-Aid? Went through a 3-minute description of this process, and she said, oh man, if I had known this 10 minutes ago, I'd have voted no. So part of the problem we've been having is educating not just our legislators, but even communities as to why this is such a bad solution to this problem.
Yeah. So basically, this technology is it's all founded on an outmoded system of waste management for hog waste, and it's actually causing more pollution in our impacted communities. Then it's also a false solution to the climate crisis. So it's being used to try to market itself as good for the climate, which it's not. And it really is what it does, though, for the industry is produce a new revenue source for the waste. And that's really the whole purpose of it, as far when you boil it down to the only, it's causing more pollution in our communities. It's prolonging hog waste management system that's outdated and highly harmful. We could get into all the chemicals and the nitrogen and ammonia and all the other chemicals that are released that are very harmful to human health. In Sampson and Duplin County, a lot of the water can't even be consumed anymore from the wells because of the pollution in the wells. A couple other factors, and then we're going to close this so Susanna could have some discussion. And we saw one of the questions already about what better technology is out there. On top of this, we have a very weak regulatory system in North Carolina that does not even recognize the cumulative and disproportionate impact of all these industries on our communities. And if you look at Sampson and Duplin County, that's what's going to happen to us in Robinson and Scotland County, where there's 15 hog farms by Smithfield in Scotland County, and an LNG they're building here. They don't even have to build an aligned facility. They'll just build more pipelines and pump it all into the LNG here in Robinson County. So what is happened already in Sampson, Duplin County will just be repeated unless the environmental justice organizations and our faith communities combine our influence together to really question both the wood pellet industry, what's called biomass, and this biogas technology, which are both false solutions. And the real problem, Susanna, and what we need to really emphasize to our faith communities is that we are now facing something in the history of the environmental movement that we've never faced before in the last 50 years. And that is, for the first time, industrial agriculture has now situated itself in the middle of the energy sector. Now, just everyone meditate on that for a minute. So for the first time in the history of our environmental movement, you have the combined economic and political power of the fossil fuel industry, now combined with the economic and political power of industrial agriculture. And we're just totally vulnerable already to the power of one. But when you combine the power of those two, in North Carolina, they're two of the strongest economic and political forces in the state, along with law enforcement and the gun advocates. So
Well, that's right, my brother.
we've
Matt.
never faced this. And I hope, my prayer is that the Council of Churches will understand the importance of helping to engage our faith communities in this very tragic new phase of environmental harm and destruction that is particularly being pressed on us in Eastern North Carolina.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, testify, right? Like many of you on this call and have heard me say over and over, as people of faith, we speak the truth and we seek the truth, and we have to know what that truth is in order to address what our reality is. And we've been paralyzed because of the compounding effects and injustices that have been taking place. And then communities that aren't directly impacted have been paralyzed to not even know what direction we're supposed to go in. And that's why I'm so grateful for all of you tonight for taking the time for this particular issue, because this is not currently an area that the North Carolina Council of Churches is funded or resourced to do. Again, so grateful to Susan Brooks for being a part of this and volunteering, stepping up and saying, we've got to figure out, I'm from Whiteville. She's from Whiteville. I'm putting words into her own mouth here. And I know that she's going to be helping us with the question and answer here, but your call to action, Mac, is exactly what we need to hear. And I have learned so much through these webinars tonight. I need to go back, Blakely, to your presentation, Daisha, to yours, to the ones before. Donna, so much. Just the realities. And you're right, it's not new necessarily because, and Don, I hear your words very, very, and your experience and the heartfelt notion that we need to be following Indigenous leadership and Indigenous wisdom at this time, listening to the communities, following the communities, and that collective we have so much work to do. So thank you for those of you that are putting questions in the chat. These are great questions. Blakely is going to help facilitate asking each of the presenters the question, and I'm going to let Susan go ahead and read the questions because I know the chat can get kind of messy. So Susan and Blakely, take it away.
All right. Our first question is a series of questions from John Reese. And by the way, yes, I am from Whiteville, or as we would say, Wyville. But anyway, so John says, are there any alternate technologies that are less harmful? And are the alternate technologies acceptable? And are there acceptable technologies being implemented in other states?
Thanks, Susan, for reading that out. And thanks, John, for that question. I've communicated to a couple of the other speakers, and I'm happy to briefly address that before we jump into some of the other questions, and I'll pass those off to others. But yes, there are other technologies that are cleaner, that address many of the pollution and health concerns that we've been discussing tonight. And without getting too much into the weeds on what those technologies look like, I can name a couple of components of those technologies that would really I think go a long way in addressing the pollution and health concerns that we've discussed. So some context here is helpful. Back in the year 2000, Smithfield Foods agreed to invest $15 million in developing and implementing cleaner technologies. They took the first step. They invested a lot of money in developing technologies, but then they never actually implemented any of those technologies. There were several that were developed with that money and with some expert researchers at NC State and other institutions. But unfortunately, that research didn't result in any change on the ground. But in the intervening years, many of those technologies have evolved. The costs have come down. And Smithfield, in fact, is using some of these technologies at its hog operations in other states, in Missouri in particular. So some of the components of the cleaner technologies are solid liquid separation. Part of what creates the pollution problems that communities are experiencing today is the fact that hog waste is kept in these giant, is wet waste kept in these giant open air pits. And that is the source of methane, that's the source of odor. And it did, hog waste doesn't have to be managed that way. And I should say, ultimately, we should be treating hog waste like human waste. We have wastewater treatment plants to process all the waste that we as humans generate every day, and we should be doing the same thing with hog waste, of which there is a lot in Eastern North Carolina. So again, back to the technologies: solid liquid separation, nitrification, denitrification to address ammonia emissions. Tools or modules that address the phosphorus pollution, and other filtration systems. And again, some of these modules have been used in other states. North Carolinians deserve the same protections as folks who live in Missouri or anywhere else in the world, where this technology is being used on the ground to address water pollution, air pollution, odors, ammonia emissions, and so on. I'm happy to continue the conversation offline, but there's so many other questions to get to. I'd like to go to the next one. And Susan, I'm not sure if you have others. I see a few in the chat. Do you want me to go to the chat and take those, Susan?
I'll hand them to you.
Okay.
The next one is a question and a comment. Given that Biden has just announced our role, and this is from Pam Schwingel. Given that Biden has just announced our role in reducing methane at the COP20, how much of this reduction will be directed towards the CAFO industry? Given the hype to capture methane from COP20, it will be used as PR in North Carolina too.
Thanks for that question. And Donna, I wonder if you might be able to field that question since you've been following all of these climate developments closely. And Daisha, and Mac, if you have comments to add, please jump in. But let's start with Donna. And Donna, you're on mute. Thanks.
you could tell by me talking that I'm not trying to be silent. Yeah, it was interesting to hear President Biden with that particular development. I want to name one of the concerns around the digester methane, generated methane. One of the developments in the United States, and REPS was mentioned earlier in RINs in terms of being able to have a energy declared renewable, and then being able to get credits, tax credits for using renewable fuels. So one of the developments that's actually in play in North Carolina is that the factory farm methane gas being used along with the wood pellet biomass to generate electricity for electric car chargers. Our concern is that even with the declaration of reducing methane from the current pipelines and the current energy sources, is that with the declaration of the factory farm methane gas being declared renewable, it will put into another category of regulation. And so, you know, I haven't unpacked all of those, all of the parts to what he just announced, because of course those aren't available right now. But that was the very first concern I had was, will this be another time where not just North Carolina, because what we're talking about here with methane digester gas coming to fruition, it's already happening all across the country. And there's already places where it's being used for the generation of electricity. And so this isn't something that is yet to be, it's already started. And the systems are being put in place that will support the economic dimension of the agricultural industry with the utility industry to be able to gain some economic benefit from this. So yeah, the question is a good one to be paying attention to, because it is definitely something that could be used in North Carolina and across the country as why this particular form of methane is better than any other. When methane is methane is methane. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It's still not good for the environment.
Daisha or Mac, do either of you have anything to add? No. Okay. I guess Donna, thank you for your comments. And you know, I think one thing that I hope the Biden administration will commit to is addressing the climate crisis in a way that's centering communities and protecting communities, because the way, you know, that this administration, as you all are aware, has committed itself to environmental justice, but some of that is not reflected in the policies that are coming out of this administration, especially when it comes to agriculture. So I appreciate the question, and Donna, I appreciate your answer as well. And I hope we can keep putting pressure on the administration to encourage a just transition to a cleaner climate future.
And
Susan,
let me just say, I don't want it to be misunderstood. I support anything that reduces methane. So I'm glad to hear him doing this, but we cannot keep our eye off of this methane generated from hog waste, chicken waste, and other waste being an economic tool.
that's right. That's right. Thank you, Donna.
I'll just add that the critical issue is, I think most of you on this call, if you've been following the wood pellet controversy, we're the #1 producer of wood pellets in the country. North Carolina is. And the sad reality is, because of the situations in North Carolina, the combined economic and political situations and regulatory issues, we could easily become the #1 state in the nation as a biogas producer. If we don't really educate the public, educate, organize, and advocate together, we will become the #1 producer of biogas, not only with hog and chicken waste, but also cattle. So this industry is very aggressive, and they're as Larry said, their marketing is superb. And, you know, it's like David and Goliath, you know, we really have to be serious about educating the public and organizing and advocating to really create some influence in the state.
All right. We have another question in the chat from Mary Luckhouse. Would it not be best to close the CAFOs?
Sure. Daisha, do you mind starting with this one, and then we can go to others, or Mac? Daisha, I don't intend to put you on the spot, but if you wouldn't mind saying a few words about this, and maybe we can go to Mac and then Donna.
Yeah, I just full transparency. You know, I'm not, I guess, well versed on the impact that CAFOs have on our economy. But I am assuming that is a driving factor in, North Carolina not shutting down its CAFOs. As mentioned, we are one of the largest producers of pork, not only in the United States, but in the world. And so I think just given the reality of how CAFOs impact North Carolina's economy, I don't know if that is a feasible option. But maybe some can add a little bit more to that on why we can't just close CAFOs. I think, and I don't want to speak for community members or those who have been involved in this work for a very long time. But yeah, I just feel as though a lot of calls come for cleaner technology. There's better ways to do this. And so I think that would be a great start. Is finding the better and sustainable solutions that are available, and perhaps creating regulations around these CAFOs, because as it's been touched upon a lot, there's hardly any, there's basically no regulations around agricultural emissions, around agricultural practices. And so this is why it's become such a huge issue, because they can just basically do whatever they want. So yeah, I guess I'll end there.
Thanks, Daisha. Mac, you look like you want to jump in here.
Well, the solution,
leave me
you know,
sometime,
we just can't say no. Say no never works with anything. It's the bigger challenge is not to say yes. And our state said yes when Smithfield was actually run out of Virginia by the Virginia government. But both political parties, and I forgot who was governor then, but North Carolina said, come on in to North Carolina, we'll actually just give you Eastern North Carolina. There was no discussion, no policy discussion with local counties or communities, and it just happened. So now we're stuck with the largest, you know, hog, and we have the largest chicken processing center in the world in Robinson County. And like Donna said, the largest hog industry facility in the world, east of us, and Campbell Soup on the other side. So it's unrealistic to think, with agriculture being the largest industry in the state, that we'll ever stop the CAFOs. But what we can do is really promote regenerative agriculture and really make it competitive. And we have to incentivize other forms of raising hogs and chickens. And one thing we want to do in Eastern North Carolina is put a paper together, basically something like toward a new regenerative and sustainable economy for Eastern North Carolina, because we're getting 85 to 90% of all the dirty industry in the state is coming into the East. And honestly, we all know Governor Cooper's from the East, but that just doesn't matter. It's the poorest section. Eastern North Carolina is the most multiracial rural region in the entire country. It's not just because of the Lumbee. We have many indigenous tribes in the East. We have the largest Black population and a very large Latinx population in the East. And we need a lot of research done as well. My cursory research indicates that we're now poorer than Appalachia, but you never know it because it's not being addressed. And then you add the climate destruction and the hurricanes on top of this and the flooding. it just creates a whole new problem. And all of our tier 1 counties in the east are losing populations for the first time in our history and becoming poor. And then the wood pellets are deforesting the eastern part of the state more rapidly than the Amazon. So all this is happening. There's very little media coverage, very little public education about what's happening in eastern North Carolina. So we really need the faith community to become much more engaged. We need to do more tours and really send people back home to really help us be a part of this new organization of influence that we need in the state.
Mhm.
Donna, I know you wanted to jump in here as well.
Yeah, I may be married to Mac, but I can't always get his attention. But at any rate, I would say yes to everything he said. And full disclosure, I am not a vegetarian or a vegan. I do eat meat. But I think the points that Mac made in terms of the need to look at how the farming is done. The change occurred when we moved from family farms. I remember when a small farm was considered to be 300 or 400 acres. And now a small farm is a few thousand acres because of all of the merging of the family farms into these corporate entities. And so it's time to take a breath and step back and reconsider that term, concentrated agriculture. CAFO, concentrated or corporate, that is often used, animal feeding operations. Because in terms of we have it, it's here, but we also know that the climate crisis is real. And this form of corporate agriculture feeds the climate crisis. North Carolina had the first 2 major superstorms, Florence and Matthew, and we're still recovering. Folks in Robeson County have not received reparations for their homes yet to date. So if that happened from 2016 to 2021, and we're still recovering, what can we expect for the future? Someone put in the chats that we can't ignore our realities. And I agree with that. The reality is that we do have the CAFOs, but the other reality is that we need to snatch the blinders off in terms of what these corporations are doing within the confines of our state. That is not happening in other states, but that still doesn't mean that in those states that are using better technologies, that it's still okay to have CAFOs. There are diseases and illnesses related to animals being kept in such confined living arrangements. There's just so many other health-related issues to CAFOs, but we do have to deal first and foremost with the methane issue. And so, while I agree that it would be great if we could just say, we're not going to have any more hog farms, et cetera, that's not real. That's not going to happen. Humans are meat eaters by and large, I would say. And so what we have to do is go back and say, what is broken? How do we fix it? And there are answers like you've shared, Blakely, and some of the things that others have said, I won't repeat, but we have to keep beating that drum that this is a bad situation we're in right now.
Thank you, Donna. And I know that we'll have some closing comments. I would be remiss if I did not note that there will be an opportunity to elevate all of these issues, all of these messages that we've been talking about tonight in an upcoming comment period that the Department of Environmental Quality will be facilitating as the state agency develops a new program for biogas. This is a real opportunity for you as faith leaders, for your congregants, for your communities to engage in a really important process that will set the stage for biogas development in North Carolina and will have real implications for communities for years to come. So, I see Susanna nodding her head, and I hope we can share information with you all as those opportunities come along. I will stop talking there and pass the mic over to Susan and Susanna to close this out. Thank you to everyone who was speaking tonight, and thanks for having us.
Well, I want to say thank you all. This has been a very engaging and educational conversation, and especially thanks to those of you who got roped in at the last minute. You did a great job. We decided in the last webinar that our new slogan might be clean bacon, and it hasn't really caught on yet, but I'm going to push for it. But I would like to give you all just one more chance to one sentence closing remark. And if there's anything else you think communities of faith can do to help, I would certainly encourage you to say that, but whatever you want to say, one sentence each. And Blakely, you get to divvy it up.
Oh, what each of our panelists want to say. Okay, Mac, let's start with you. One sentence from you, Mac, and then Daisha, and then Donna.
I want to thank all of you in urban communities that are supporting and standing with us who are living in these impacted communities. That really, it's the isolation and the real feeling of being under assault that cause the most trauma. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you as well for just allowing me to be here today. And thank you to Donna and Mac for your continued leadership on this issue. And just for everyone, aside from what Blakely was speaking on, I'm sorry, this is not a sentence. Aside from what Blakely was speaking on, getting involved within public comments, I also just really urge you to continue to educate yourselves. Knowledge is most definitely power.
And I would just say, learn your community, find out what's happening there, find out what is most important to your people, especially if you're a church leader, and start there. And you're always welcome to visit. People leave with a shaking their head moment, but it's one that certainly does take some blinders off. So thank you.
All right, well, thank you all. Just want to say to the everybody who attended, if you don't already subscribe to the to the North Carolina Council of Churches weekly e-newsletter, please go to www.ncchurches.org to sign up, and be sure to learn about all the important educational and advocacy opportunities that you as faith communities can do in North Carolina. And I'm going to now hand it over to Susanna to close us out.
Well, you all said it. Knowledge is power. We've got a lot of work to do. Let's awaken. I know I know a lot of you that have participated in this call today. We know a lot of people, and we've got our work to do. We've got our call and our charge from the communities themselves. So let us close out this evening in prayer. We do this work because we know that we cannot love our neighbors or ourselves without loving and protecting the air we breathe, the water we drink, and ground in which our food is grown. We know that this is an issue of justice, that our Black and Brown siblings feel the impacts of climate justice and the realities of environmental degradation first and worst, that it is a systemic reality. And so this is the work that we do as movement work for justice and compassion and the creation of a sustainable and more beautiful world. May it be so. Reroot ourselves to our soils and to our souls. Thank you, everyone, so much. Wow, we hope you will share this far and wide, Facebook Live, event on your social media pages. We'll post the YouTube link of the recording as soon as it's ready. Let us embody the acknowledgement that environmental justice is climate justice and truly justice for all. Please stay safe and strong, and may we gather again soon. Thank you.